We're so happy to have you here in person and virtually with these two amazing women that sit with us today. So first, before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the Comanche, Kiowa, Kickapoo, Osage, and Wichita ancestral land on which we do business. And then from there, again, thank you today for participating here or online. If you have any questions, we will be monitoring the chat online. And for you in-person folks, we do have some sticky notes kind of around, so feel free to write questions down as we go. And we will submit those to Cynthia to ask Reverend Sheri Dickerson as we go through this chat.
My name is Cynthia Garcia, and I'm co-founder of Workflow with Chelsea Banks. This is the continuing human education here. We are inviting you into conversation with us. We're distinct from something like a TED Talk, and that we really don't want to blow your mind or prove our brilliance. We would just like to invite conversation with community. This series is over, civics in the age of social media. And I wanted to give you a quick definition of civics, which is the study of the rights and duties of citizenship. Also, Hannah Roy said something to me the other day here that I'd like to remind everyone of, which is we would like to take this opportunity as people who are committed to progressive change, to restorative justice, to recommit to each other after what we've all been through COVID and last summer, in our duties and rights to each other in social media and in person. So with that, I'm going to introduce Cynthia Garcia. She is an immigrant rights organizer and activist, and someone I'm very honored to know, and also thank the Reverend Sheri for being here, and someone who I'm also deeply humbled and honored to be able to know and occasionally get to spend time with. So welcome, ladies, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone who's here in person, and if you're joining us online. I welcome also questions for folks that are tuning in. And as well, we're inviting everyone to join not just this conversation, but this is an actual series of multiple conversations with different community leaders, but more than anything with, as Ginger shared, with folks who are committed and invested in the betterment, not just of our communities here, but just at large. And so, I guess I can start with introducing Sheri, which I think Sheri has her own introduction, and for many of the folks who are already here, you may already know, Sheri's not just an activist and an organizer, she's a dear friend, and just a profound storyteller. I think that one of the things that really drive me into following her leadership is just the way in which community is built everywhere she's coming into the space. And so, yeah, I wanna start with you briefly. If you wanna start, I know that you have a lot of engagement in different groups, Sheri, over 25 years of community organizing, whether it's at the Oklahoma City BLM chapter or at the Women's March. I know that we've had the opportunity to collaborate there before in the past. You are literally, I can go on a list of boards and spaces that you currently are not only building together, but your leadership as well appreciated. So I think we can do that quick introduction first, and then we'll get into some of the richness of the conversation.
Is that introduction necessary? I am a third generation PK. For those of y'all that don't know what that means I am a preacher's or a pastor's kid. And so a lot of the work that I do was by force, if not by choice. And so I laugh because working in service to others and ministry, if we call it, was something that I learned was the norm and obligatory responsibility of every human being. And so I try to be mindful of having love at my core, which is what most of my, I call my lineage supporters, who are now my ancestors, taught me, and that is just what I do. And I am blessed to be in community with amazing humans like that of yourself, and Ginger and Chelsea that we saw earlier, many of the people that are here with us today, and even people who are lurking outside looking in the windows that I love that are my family. And so, if I was going to be introduced, I just always tell everyone I am just simply Sheri.
Thank you. And I think for folks who don't know me, or maybe it's the first, second, who knows, time that you see me anywhere. My name is Cynthia Garcia. As Ginger shared, I'm an immigrant rights organizer, but more than anything, I'm an Oklahoman by choice. And what that means is I'm an undocumented queer woman who wasn't born in the state, who migrated here in the US at the age of 15, who has made Oklahoma City her home ever since. And this conversation is particularly interesting to me because, as the definition of civics is the right to citizenship. And so it's a bold statement to tie all the work that we already do while I don't have citizenship. And I think it's important to talk about that because the way that often community organizing, community building, and power building gets dismissed by that very same fact. The fact that there are people in our communities who are undocumented, whose full humanity often gets tied to that citizenship. And so even when I think of like what are the things that we're doing and the rights and the civic duties, it's a little bit of a comedy for me in the way that I think of like fighting for democracy and, you know, civic engagement, and the way that immigrant people, even in this last election, were mobilizing thousands of people at a time to actually change leadership because it was literally life and death for so many of our communities. And that was important because citizenship isn't what drives us to do the things that we do more often than not. And specifically when we think about the composition of Oklahoma and the historical context of actually the erasure and genocide of indigenous communities, I think it's important that we talk about that. And so I'm excited to keep thinking together and sharing, and I invite the questions, and I invite folks who might be tuning in to, you know, raise what are some points of discussion that you would like to include. So I think we can start with just a general question of like, you know, what is or what do you see being one of the challenges of the lack of education and knowledge actually around civics and what that means for our communities?
So, the lack of education or knowledge really on any aspect is very problematic, and it's disturbing for me. But civics has been something that I loved. I remember being in 8th grade, sitting in Mr. Stolbach's class, who just taught this thing that resonated for me. And it came alive, and it really tied to me the understanding of what being community and being and working within systems to be able to really empower people. When you're in 8th grade, I don't know that you're aware of a lot of the schisms that are happening outside that community of, and I went to Millwood, so that's a whole institution in itself. So shout out to my Falcons. But to watch the process, I wanted to get into Girl State and understand what happened, and found out that my older sister had actually been the first African American woman to ever be elected to the head of Girl State, and then have it literally taken, because at that time it was not okay for a Black woman to hold that position. And how did that evolve? Well, you know, she became a federal district judge and was Chief Justice. And so, but in that, I think it was somewhat kind of fan worship of watching my sister just kind of excel in that, but she ignited my love for civics. And we don't see any examples of that in the educational systems, in community today. And so I'm trying to figure out how to inspire, how to motivate, as well as mobilize people working within these systems to be able to protect one another. I've constantly said that, and I mean this, you are my friend, you are my family, and I would use my body to block harm or prevent someone from trying to infringe on your rights as a human. Because, I mean, what is citizenship? If you are here, if you are participating in everyday life, in society, you are a citizen of a larger community. And so, I think if we don't begin to instill that as the education around civics, then we're lost. We're lost from the very beginning. And that's what I think is most problematic.
Yeah, definitely. And you know what I'm also hearing you say, and I want to highlight, as we're thinking, just even of like, what is citizenship, what does it mean, and how does even the concept, right, of like our duties as a citizen, 2020, and I'm sure there's a statement that is tired about the unprecedented year that we've had and all the unprecedented events, right? The 2020 really highlighted something that I don't think many of us have actually sat down and digested fully. There's a virus that literally stopped the country in its track. And regardless of where he originated or all the xenophobic and racist messaging that's behind it, the reality is that when we think about citizenship and our duties as people, something that happened or that starts anywhere else in the globe is still impacting our day-to-day lives. Today, we're sitting here with a mask, right? Distance, battling access barriers to vaccines, battling, even in other states in the US, right? The request for citizenship, for proof of citizenship, for someone to be vaccinated. As if that very same citizenship denies them of the right to live. As if we don't understand that millions of people will be left out of that COVID relief. And as long as millions of people continue to be exposed to the virus, like, we are not all healing, we're not recovering. Recovery with loopholes around who gets access to funding, to survival income, to vaccinations is not recovery. And the way that citizenship is weaponized has long-lasting impacts on people's lives. Not in a title, right? Because people get also lost in like, well, immigrants who got here the right way do deserve that. The people who are workers do deserve that. The people who, and I'm just like, we are tying the right to live to citizenship. And not only immigrants know how heavy that is, indigenous people who we already literally killed for generations know that. Because it's not only immigrants who are experiencing the everlasting impact of citizenship as a tool, right? In many ways of white supremacist ideologies. And I know that's a really heavy thing to take on. But it's the reflections that we need to make ourselves as we're thinking about how are we actually uplifting or enabling those very same tools. And so, yeah, I think that's a perfect bridge to talk about just the consequences, right, of that lack of knowledge or the lack of acknowledgement in this space. And I know you probably more than likely have a lot to share on that end.
Well, I mean, there's a scripture, there's an adage, and it says that people perish for lack of knowledge. And in this moment, that is never more evident, because people also have a lack of knowledge of what basic and simple humanity is and is supposed to be. How is that supposed to be encapsulated in each of us? When we have a state legislature who literally is putting restrictions and regulations on the educational process. Like now they want to say that to be able to graduate, you have to be able to pass a citizenship test. And I said, and this was totally a Sheriism, this was only me, what I said, I would be willing to bet, if I was a gambling person, I would put a lot of money on the fact that most of those people that are pushing for that policy change could not pass that test. And I mean, I was like, that's just absurd, and it was extremely offensive to me. And these are the things that you're focusing on while people are literally dying. And we're seeing the disparity of people dying who bear skin like yours and mine, and black and brown skin. Those who are women or femmes or non-males are dealing with all of the issues around this pandemic within the epidemic of white supremacy and racism, which all of our problems stem from those two systems. Whether we want to admit it or not, you did say that it was heavy. It is heavy because it is true. It is heavy because it is unacceptable. And it is heavy because it is literally draining or forcing the life force out of humans. Today, I saw an announcement that there was another 400 cases of COVID reported here in Oklahoma, which means the consequence of maybe misinformation, lack of acknowledgement about just the systems that comes from COVID. What was gonna happen when you went to a trip for spring break? What was gonna happen when you got together? I mean, I'm clergy, and I still was not an advocate for in-person assembly, even in our systems of faith, because I don't want to celebrate life or a resurrection of life by endangering lives. The cognitive dissonance in that is just, it's actually frightening at times. And it causes a stress for me because I'm constantly trying to figure out how to educate and how to enlighten people to get them to understand that the plight that we're in is literally putting your life, my life, our children's lives, our parents and our grandparents' lives in danger, and we are losing this battle. We are losing this battle, and all of the systems, like the judicial systems, the legislative systems, we're only a block or two away from the detention center, and at one time, 33% were positive for COVID, and how do you quarantine inside of a place that disenfranchises the simple humanity of a person? So that lack of knowledge is what is literally deteriorating us as a community, us as society, and overall. And this is happening not just here, but happening all across the globe. But we should not be having these types of issues in this country when we have the access to information. We have scientists, because we don't want to listen to science. We can't talk about civics without human ecology, which is a science, and say how that bridges in. So I'm hoping that these types of conversations, as well as those that have been tireless in giving information and accurate facts and information to be able for people to protect themselves, that this information is going to continue to spread. Wouldn't it be nice if things like this became viral, like some of the other things that we're having to see?
Right. And I think, yeah, you're also touching important points around like the interconnectedness of not just civics, but access to information, right? Credible information. I think that during the social media, I mean, as social media continues to even be more integrated and part of our daily lives, it's really easy for something to go from a lie that an individual made up into like a full conspiracy of people who are now doubling down on that knowledge, right? And falsely, frankly. And I think that you're also touching on not just, you're already like getting at the point around the impact of community of color. And I think it's critical that as we talk about like what are our civic duties, and as we talk about what are the impact of when we don't, we talk a lot about meeting the moment. And we talk about change, and I really want to ground that in Oklahoma, because as someone who can't vote, as someone who's often stripped away of like actual civic engagement that isn't, right, and also the concept that like civic engagement is only voting, that's also false.
Right.
Because there's so much more, which is the reason why I say I'm Oklahoma by choice. But the piece around is the impact when we're only responding into what community building is by thinking that the only goal is to go cast a vote. Like our only duty is every so often we go vote, and then we don't get the person that we wanted to elect it, and then we're back at the same place. And trust me, as someone who can't even vote, I feel it. But there is the other pieces around what are we needing to build so that we're not just responding, right? Because what I've learned over the last almost 2 decades living here is that there is mobilizing weeks before the election and then post-election. And then it's sort of like thinking about, peaks and the slopes that we're actually seeing. And I would love to like get your input of like, how is that actually detrimental to communities of color?
So many systems that we've already acknowledged exist. And it is intentional and it is deliberate to destroy the nucleus of our families, our communities, and access to simple basic needs like having a grocery store. And so why does there need to be a vote to pass a tax so that they can put in simple places that provide nutrition, that provide access for people to go and get exercise, places for enjoyment, and communal spaces like parks. That's why I say, and it's not really, some people will say, well, we're in a desert. Well, I don't think of it as a desert. It's an apartheid, because it is something that has been deliberately taken away. We're in an educational apartheid. We're in a food apartheid. We're in a community apartheid because we're watching gentrification. And so when we think about redlining and gerrymandering, how they literally change all of these things to prevent an assembly of those with similar thought and political stands to be able to vote in that particular block, to be able to push for progressive change. And I don't, do I think of myself as a progressive person? Yes, based on my own definition. But I know that I also am constantly surrounded by those that I refer to as progressives and snowgressives, because there is this ideology that comes from my white allies and accomplices, because their lens is so different, so they don't understand the oppression that I deal with on a daily basis. They don't understand that when you and I get up in the morning, we exist, and should we have the opportunity to vote, that just living in black and brown skin is a protest. And it is how we have to center our entire life. When you have a lot of people in a building that creates bondage, and you remove their ability to participate in the democratic process, that's voter suppression, but that also takes away the power. So all of this is about the power hierarchy and the structure. And so again, like I said, that goes back to white supremacy, because there is a fear. When I looked at listening to Representative Olson, I hate even giving his name energy, but when he literally associated the struggle for, he said that basically the fight for against abortion was greater than the fight for abolition against slavery. I mean, my whole body, I mean, I cracked the screen on my phone because I threw it, yelling just like the ignorance. And white supremacy says, especially in systems like that, which these people were votes got them where they are. They're supposed to be representative of their area. And God help us if that is the case. If the people with this ideology are the ones that are driving what is happening all across the state. But there's no fear of consequence. Very few people stood up and even challenged such a derogatory and hurtful. It was very painful for me to hear that. He didn't care, and he doubled down when he was asked for clarification by Representative Pittman. And then he went on to say, you know, but can't you understand that I would rather be a living slave than a dead baby? And I was like, so can we be real, even about abortion, when you all are taking votes on the floor saying that you're pro-life? You don't care about what happens to black and brown children from wombed persons who are carrying that life. You only want to make sure that white babies are not aborted so that your numbers will increase because you're paying attention to the statistics. And you know that the rise in people of color and communities of color has surpassed you. That is why, because you're not pro-life, you're pro-white. And we have to be diligent in continually revealing the intention and motives inside the democratic process. And I don't know that that's just, and I certainly work within the party, within the Democratic Party, and I know that there's just as much racism and oppression as white supremacy within that particular party. I'm watching what a group of people, even, and white men, the fragility that is coming from that particular sector against a black woman who is the current chair and the first black chair in Oklahoma. I've watched her experience be marred by simple fragility and the toxicity of trying to push against her. We even have a white male who was running against her that really was associating the fact that the voice of the white male had been squandered. And I'm like, you've had 400 damn years to be able to push your agenda, and you still want to cause this type of oppression, and you're ignorant to the fact that you too are upholding the systems of white supremacy, and you want to say something in rebuttal and say that your feelings are hurt when people speak out and speak truth to that. And you don't want to deal with that if you are part of that system, if you're born in white skin, that you came from the entire diatribe of racist culture. And racism, being racist, is not a deal breaker for most of us, because if being racist was, I would not have any white friends or family. But my friends, my accomplices, those that do this work with me, that are trying to help with liberation of Black and brown people, and queer folks within those communities, they're being anti-racist. And so they try to empower my voice by helping empower my vote. They're trying to dismantle the systems of voter suppression. So they say that it does not matter if you have been charged in the system, because how many people are innocent, are sitting in the prison industrial complex. And so, but that takes away their ability to vote and participate in democracy. When we see where people are literally afraid to go out into places to be able to vote because they worry about what's going to happen, because they have impugned fear amongst communities about the quote-unquote violence that's supposedly there. That is voter suppression. Voter suppression comes from when you don't educate your juniors and seniors in high school that at 17, they can go and get registered, so that the moment that they turn 18, that first election, they can cast their vote. Voting is one of the superpowers. Now, there are people who say, especially here in Oklahoma, so many of my friends in Black skin are like, I just don't feel like my vote matters. And I understand being disenfranchised, because colonization and settler terrorism ideology has led us to that place. We've been taught that it does not matter. That's another form of voter suppression, which is another symptom and byproduct of white supremacy. So I'm just seeing it happen, and when you talked about the slopes and the rise, it's so consistent and it's so heavy, but it's very subtle, because a lot of the white supremacists here in Oklahoma, they are some of the politest people that you will ever encounter. And so they will say things like, oh, I don't like Black people. They will use racial slurs like niggers and chinks and wetbacks and all of these things, and then they will wish you to have a nice day. Open the door for you, because they're wanting you to exit their parameter and their space. But we cannot continue to protect or not acknowledge the mask that comes from white supremacy. Because there was a time when they wore masks to be able to shield their identity. And now it is so overt, and just because it comes in a polite package does not make it acceptable. And it certainly should not be part of the democratic process of this here republic.
And I know that, thank you, Sheri, that my brain is just turning wheels and just like everything that you shared. And I know we wanted to make this space also a bilingual opening for inviting communities, because we know language access, period.
Right.
It's also important. And so I'm gonna do a quick recap in just Spanish for folks who may be tuning in. La conversación que estamos teniendo el día de hoy, más que nada, es específicamente sobre el rol que toma el participar cívicamente en el Estado, en el país, pero también cuál es nuestra responsabilidad global realmente de hablar de este tipo de sistemas. Estamos hablando del impacto y las consecuencias que tiene el no tener acceso realmente a tener información, no solamente para nuestras comunidades, pero también el incremento de misinformación, no solamente cuando viene a esta pandemia, a cómo votar, a cómo ser representado localmente, pero en cuál es la razón que motiva a personas que están en oficinas que tienen poder a seguir empujando pólizas, leyes y restricciones en las que nuestra comunidad puede hacer su voto y su voz valer. Entonces, Sheri ha compartido con nosotros que la razón y el pilar realmente de toda esta participación o falta de viene siendo de una herramienta de la supremacía blanca. La supremacía blanca que ve consistentemente que nuestra gente sigue creciendo en números, sigue creciendo en participación, y ellos utilizan cualquier herramienta disponible para parar y frenar ese progreso. El progreso se necesita no solamente con el partido o un partido o el otro, pero en sí en nuestra comunidad incompleta. That was just a short summary. I know that you had to kind of wait, and it was intentional that we normalize the access that language gives us. And so you'll hear me do a couple of recaps. That is the goal for all the sessions. We're actually including more of that. And I did a recap, which means I didn't interpret everything that Sheri said, because she literally took us to church with all of the information. But before I move on to a couple of our last questions, I wanted to see if there are any questions that have come on the screen yet, or if any of y'all have something that you want to share, or anything that has come up yet for you as we're having this conversation. All right, so the point being brought up is there has been a lot of talk recently about the rights of citizenship. What are your views on the responsibilities of national or global citizenship, or should one trump the other? Well, that's a rich question. Thank you.
Should one trump the other? So I think just simply as being someone who exists, coming from the lens of Black Lives Matter, saying that our life matters is simply one step above acknowledging the fact that we exist in this planet around everyone else. And there is a call for equity from Black and brown persons, saying that for far too long, the oppressive systems have taken from us. And so I would say that the responsibility right now is on those that still hold a large percent of the power hierarchy to offer equity, to advocate for that, and to really create bridges to where, one, here in this country, where we would be the example of how to actually bring actual community into all of our spaces. But are you willing to reduce or share the wealth that you have accrued because you've had the ability to do so? A lot of Black and brown people, we're not able to have home ownership. We cannot secure land. We see even in systems, we were talking yesterday about participating in process of bringing change. And some of the requirements are you need to be a home owner. How offensive is that, and how unrealistic in this day and time, when we're seeing the effects of a pandemic, when we've been living again in the epidemic of white supremacy for so long. So there is a responsibility, it is obligatory, and language is important. So we're needing the people that are in the positions of power to, one, acknowledge the damage and the harm and the trauma that they continue to filter in all of these different factions. We need them to be transparent in their intentional push for policy change. And we need it to be more of a collective shared power. And I'm always going to end with saying, be prepared to step aside and allow Black and brown women, but especially Black women, to lead into spaces of leadership, because if these are the divine creatures that have birthed creation as we know it, then surely they are going to nurture it appropriately. And when Black women rise, everyone does, because they're going to make sure that community becomes a global theology and ideology. And so I think that is what we should be obligatory, should be put on as a responsibility to every living human. And it is something that should be taught, even more so than some of the things we see in school. Now, I have a lot of respect for my teachers that taught me geometry and algebra and trigonometry, or I should say those that really gave every effort, because I still have not mastered it, and I have accepted that I have a phobia of some mathematical systems, but I do believe that there are certain things about simply how to be in community should be taught from the very beginning. That should be included at nap time, how to exist without invading space, how to ask for consent in every aspect, and so that the power structures don't think that it's okay to literally to take from me, to take my autonomy, to take from my agency, because those types of systems, even mathematical systems, because it creates a class system and a caste system, it tells us that if you are not able to master this, because this is the curriculum that is supposed to be mainstream, which nothing really is, and that form of thought has been normalized, it teaches that that's how they separate people. Those that have a different learning style, because it's not a disability, it's just a difference. People who don't have the same level of sensory processing. So if a person who is impaired by sight or hearing, they have another strength that helps them to be able to bring in and process all of this information. And that is absolute genius, how we are created to be able to adapt. And that our uniqueness is what really should be celebrated amongst community. And that is something that also is obligatory within citizenship. I consider myself a sanctuary citizen, to where I say someone who is dealing with oppression, especially within the system of immigration justice, can come to me and I will help find sanctuary for you, or you will be able to come and find a place of asylum. That is not something that we should ever really have to offer, because we're simply saying that I think you as a human has the right to feel safe and protected, to be able to exist in this same space. And I don't think that should be based upon where you happen to be birthed. Your existence and your place of birth should not determine the system of class that we have in this country.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the thing I would love to just build on from what you shared is that even in the concept of like global citizenship, right? Like, and there's just a lot of conversation even within the immigrant rights movement of like, okay, well, if citizenship is not equal, because that's also another thing, right? As you get engaged and as you pin down white supremacy at their core and colonialism at the core of all the other structures that are really keeping everybody separated or intentionally separating people, right? I always think of the way in which even our history doesn't acknowledge the relationship that we have with the land. And it doesn't acknowledge that, like, we can build a whole identity around nationalism, around the US, the world, or the world power country, whatever, that where everybody wants to come. Because the ideology is that, well, all of the immigrants want to come here because of such a great country, without the acknowledgement of the hoarding of resources, of the intentional billions of dollars in budgets to militarize and destabilize other countries. People don't come here because they want U.S. citizenship. People are seeking what in many ways, colonial ways, militarization has driven them out of their own home.
And we did that.
And we did that as a nation, right? As an entity. I think of MS-13, for example. It's like the boogeyman of why we don't want open borders. All MS-13 people are gonna come here and kill people and do all these things. And I think we just literally killed 500,000 people because of inept leadership to address the virus that could have been prevented. MS-13 didn't do that. And if you really want to deep dive into how U.S. imperialism has destabilized places like Haiti, El Salvador, Venezuela, then you begin to see a pattern. Who's at the border right now? Haitian, Venezuelan immigrants, people from South and Latin America who we have our hands full of the resources we've taken. We have our hands full in the way that we consistently support keeping their democracy intact. But somehow we always benefit from that engagement. Same thing that happens in the Middle East, same thing that happens in any country. And then when we have gotten to the point where there's a dependency, because then it becomes a dependency, right? You extract the resources, you destabilize democracy, you destabilize people from having a safe community, having food. Then what happens? People are forced to migrate. And it always shocks me and strikes me when people say, well, just get in line because that way you get citizenship and then that way things will change. And then I think of all the community members who are Black. Right now, they're rising hate against Asian communities and AAPI communities. Citizenship doesn't protect them. That doesn't. And what we're seeing is that increasingly, all of the systems are crumbling, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. The reason why people are on house or has housing instability right now because of COVID is the same reason why we have millions of abandoned homes and people in the street instead. The reason why basic income was completely ridiculous until we decided to do stimulus checks instead of survival relief, because otherwise people will die. It's because our priorities have always been about hoarding other people's resources and then blame them for wanting to come and have access to those resources here. And if there's one thing that natural disasters have shown us, is that people will do everything in their power to protect their life. We saw it in Katrina, we've seen it time and time in Oklahoma, every time there's a disaster with tornadoes, with this ice storm. Community responded. Local politics didn't do that. The church didn't do that. Churches were closed. The Thunder hosted a game challenges throughout the day. So when I tell you that it's not that we don't have the resources, or that citizenship protects us from the violence, our priorities are wrong. And our priorities are wrong because we're made to believe that a flag across our chest makes us better than somebody else. That protecting that imaginary line, and I tell you imaginary because the ocean is both on Mexico's side and the U.S. The fence, the wall, the border doesn't stop the water from flowing back and forth as it wants to. And so when you think about what is the concept of global citizenship, or being a national of this country, or being a U.S. citizen, we're forgetting the relationship that we have to the land and to one another. And if the only thing that is driving our shared interest about your well-being and my well-being, and the people in this room and the people joining us, it's only tied to where we're born, or only tied to where we live, then what was the purpose of the last year showing us that we will literally die without synergy of protecting each other? And so I know we're getting at almost like the closing part of our conversation, but you were already touching base on who builds curriculum, how coding and technology and social media has impacted even the way that we receive news and the type of information we get. So I'm welcoming you into expanding a little bit of that, because I know that you get really excited on that.
So when we think about how much access to knowledge and information that we have in this small device, because I remember when we were excited, I'm dating myself, about Atari and Sega Genesis and a DOS program at work. But from the inception of those amazing advances in technology to today, still very white, male dominated in the coding, in the access, in what information is actually filtered to us. And so that's another system that needs to be dismantled. And so how do we go about that? Are we going to get this group of white males who decide that they don't want to play the role of white savior and say, then let us share the resource, or let us remove ourselves? I was talking to someone who holds much of the wealth of Oklahoma inside the gallery of the Capitol. And as he was speaking, he said, you know, I really do hope that things change. And I said, you could change the entire state in a swipe of a pen if you were prepared to no longer be a billionaire. And let me tell you the good news about this is that you could still have $999,999,099 and be okay, and your generations after you, 3 and 4 or 5 generations, would still be fine if you were prepared simply to not be a billionaire, to be able to change the lives and the culture of everyone just in your state. And there's more than one of you in this state, sir. So, do you really mean what you say? Because I noticed that he and I had the same type of phone. So I laughed, I said, okay, so we are both team Android. Yes, I'm a little petty because I've been getting beat up about iPhones all week. But I said, I understand how to navigate through this. But this was designed to also oppress. Because I don't have access to the education to be able to use this fully. There's so many programs and aspects in here that I will never understand how to operate the apps or what will make this function more, or how to make this work for me, or how to make this device here make me money. Where his device, he was constantly able to go on and monitor that he's making, somewhere about $300,000 or $400,000 a day. Doing absolutely nothing but allowing his wealth to accrue more. So that is what we see. We were sitting inside the state capitol listening to the gyneticians, and that's a word that me and some of my friends have created for politicians who think that they are gynecological specialists, because they can make decisions around the bodies of wombed persons and families. Because for some reason they are obsessed with the access. They want more access to my body, my yoni than they ever deserve, and they don't give a damn about consent. So these gyneticians working with these billionaires, trying to form basically an autocratic style government here in Oklahoma. Then we have someone who doesn't want to give, who is the person that is not a proponent for vaccines, who leads the state, who finally got one, but but you have access, and to the technology that can help us. I mean, how many people were frustrated getting on their phones and their laptops, and a lot of people who are marginalized don't have access to any of this type of technology. So they didn't even have awareness about the vaccine. But it took hours and days of people being diligent and vigilant and simply trying to get a vaccine for their loved ones or themselves. I'm fortunate because of all of my comorbidities, being a person of, what do I want to tell? She said, you're a person of distinctive size. I was like, I know that I'm fat and we don't have to, I don't need you to try to change the language, because that's a form of fat shaming and body shaming. When I said, but thank God that this is one of the times where my obesity actually was a benefit, because it moved me up in the hierarchy of getting a vaccine. But I still felt guilty, because I don't think that my fatness should make a difference as to whether or not another person has access to something that is going to protect them and save all of us and save lives. Access, information, and white male dominance of these systems it still boggles my mind. And some of them are not very efficient or proficient in even using these systems. And that's not shot, because one of the people that I respect most is in this room and happens to be a white male, but I sometimes give them a pass.
Thank you. And now we're getting to the closing. And so I want to do another quick recap and just share in Spanish a little bit of what the second section was. Particularmente la segunda porción de esta conversación. Hablamos realmente de lo que ha sido el impacto de la falta de acceso a vacunas para personas que están aún peleando COVID-19. Estamos realmente hablando de cómo es que toda la conversación sobre inmigración, las personas que llegan aquí a este país, han sido desestabilizadas en su propio país, porque hay un aspecto de imperialismo de los Estados Unidos, de tomar recursos de Latinoamérica, de Asia, de otros países, que realmente entonces mueve a la gente fuera de sus comunidades. Y lo que queremos realmente empujar es que el nosotros estar saludables, el tener acceso a refugio, hogar, a comunidad, no debería estar conectado con ciudadanía. Entonces creo que vamos a tener más conversaciones. Espero puedan mandarnos preguntas. Si tienen preguntas en español, vamos a estar contestándolas y vamos a cerrar. And so we're closing. I know that there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm interested to see and hear how you're taking care of yourself. Because there's something that you said about how much weight there is in our body for doing day-to-day conversations. And just waking up in the morning, it's already, like you said, a form of protest. So I want to make sure we talk about that for a minute before we go.
So I'm drinking a lot of water because water is life, and I appreciate the nourishment and the nurturing that Mother Earth provides to us. Just being the phenom that she is, and so I try to take moments to where I'm breathing. I'm learning a process of relaxation. I had a friend who sent me some music to listen to be able to get adequate rest, because I am an insomniac, and I tend to mother everyone. So I'm trying to learn how to step back, and some of my bonus children are telling me to sit down and shut up, as well as some of my elders are, and I am always respectful. And I'm just trying to learn how to increase joy, understand that encompassing and embracing joy is part of liberation work. I'm planning a getaway or a trip with my friends, and making sure that everyone understands why we do what we do, and that is all about love, and trying to look in the mirror and love myself more and differently.
Thank you, Sheri. Thank you for everyone that joined us. We'll welcome you for our next session. The dates are already on the page. If you have questions, all this conversation is really built on the feedback that we're getting. So please share the video, share the information that you want us to touch base on, and it's been a pleasure.
And I love you for real. Thank you, everybody.